This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to Roots and All. This week's guest is Martin Harvey, an entomologist and biological recorder based at the UK CEH Biological Record Centre. His main areas of work include the iRecord online recording system, liaison with national recording schemes, and the UK Pollinator Monitoring Scheme. Martin enjoys watching and recording hoverflies, and I was delighted he agreed to an interview, as, although I know next to nothing about them, I do love seeing them in the garden, and I'm always keen to find out more. My first question to Martin was to ask how he became interested in hoverflies.
Well, my interest in hoverflies, I suppose, goes back quite a long time. In fact, ever since I was a kid, I've been interested in wildlife. And in fact, it was moths were the first sort of group of insects that I got seriously interested in when I was a kid. But having got interested in moths, I then sort of started noticing that there are lots of other insects out there and started getting interested in other groups as well. And for some reason, flies are one of the other groups that I've taken a particular interest in, and hoverflies are one of the most obvious and, in a way, the most attractive groups of flies, I suppose, a lot of people would say, and they, of course, attracted my attention. So I've always had that sort of background interest as a wildlife enthusiast. And then in my working life, I've ended up being involved in a lot of the data management side of things, in bringing together the records of wildlife that lots and lots of people send in from all over the country. And there are all sorts of recording schemes, including one that focuses on hoverflies. And my work these days is at the Biological Record Centre at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And one of the things we do at the Biological Record Centre is to work with the recording schemes that are mostly volunteer-led to help them bring all the data together and to make that link into the research world and see what information can be gained from that.
And am I correct in thinking that you work on the UK Pollinator Monitoring Scheme?
That's right. That's one of the projects that UKCH and a number of other partners set up a few years ago. And again, that links into the hoverfly recording scheme and some of the other pollinator recording schemes. And with the help of many volunteers, again, we are collecting information on insects visiting flowers. And there's a couple of different surveys that the Pollinator Monitoring Scheme runs, which anybody can join in with. And that includes a focus on hoverflies. The thing that the Pollinator Monitoring Scheme is particularly focusing on is to try and get an idea of the change in numbers of pollinators. So the existing recording schemes are very, very good at picking up changes in distribution and which species are moving north or which ones are spreading out or declining in that sense. But it's actually quite hard to get data on the total numbers of pollinators. And that's one of the things that the Pollinator Monitoring Scheme is trying to build up, is a better picture of just the total numbers of pollinating insects that are visiting the flowers.
And have you found anything out in particular in terms of just, I'm thinking headline figures, regards the population of flies?
I wish I could tell you that. Unfortunately, these sorts of monitoring schemes are really long-term projects. And although POMS is what we call the Pollinator Monitoring Scheme, and POMS is now into its fifth year of full data collection. But even with 5 years of data, we're only just starting to get to the point where we can start to get properly statistically supported information out of that data. So we don't have any big headline figures about whether numbers are going up or down at the moment. But as time goes on, we will start to be able to produce more data. What the current survey results have been able to do is to allow us to combine them with the existing recording scheme data. And by bringing together different data sets in that way, it helps increase the accuracy of those. And we know from some of those other data sets that there are definitely some concerns over pollinators. And there have been declines measured in several of the pollinating groups, including hoverflies. It's not a picture of decline across the board. There are some species increasing, but unfortunately the figures at the moment do suggest that more are decreasing than are increasing. But as I say, the Pollinator Monitoring Scheme itself, with this focus on the total numbers, is just beginning to get to the point where in a year or two's time, we should be able to start giving some more definite information about what those are adding up to.
And as that's an ongoing project, is there still time for people to feed into that with their own observations?
Very much so, yes. And so there's two surveys that are run by POMS, and one of those is known as the Flower Insect Timed Count, or FIT count. And that's designed to be done by anybody, anywhere, really. So if you've got flowers, at least the potential for insects to be visiting those flowers, then this count just takes 10 minutes. There's a free app that you can use to help you with it, and lots of guidance on our website about how to get involved with that. And basically, you just find a patch of a particular flower. You have to sort of mark out a 50 centimetre by 50 centimetre square in which to do your count. And then you spend 10 minutes just sitting and watching the flowers and counting the insects that land on them. And for that one, you don't necessarily need to be able to identify every insect as a species, and we just ask you to count them into major groups. So whether it's a honeybee or a bumblebee or a hoverfly or an other fly and a few other categories, but they're just counted into those groups. And that's something that anybody can take part in, really, if you go and download the information from the website or, as I say, use the app. And really, it's one of these surveys that benefits from as many counts as possible being done in as many different places. So if anybody's interested in that, please do go and check out the details and get involved. That'd be fantastic.
And if you wanted to identify a hoverfly, how are they distinct from bees or other flies?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And some of them, I think, are quite obvious. And I think a lot of people will have a good familiarity with the typical black and yellow stripy hoverfly. But they can be tricky to tell apart from other insects. And one of the reasons for that is that hoverflies are really trying to make themselves look like other insects. They are trying to imitate the bees and wasps that have stings. Hoverflies themselves don't have stings, and that is part of their defense, is to pretend to be these other insects. And that can make them a bit tricky to identify sometimes. But their behaviour is quite distinctive in the way that they hover. Not very many bees can do that. There's one or two that can, but most bees can't hover in the same way as hoverflies can. There's some other features, for instance, the fact that hoverflies have very large eyes. Bees have quite large eyes, but they don't cover as much of the head as the hoverfly eyes do. And they do have a real look to them, I think, once you get keyed into looking at the head and the shape of the eyes. The hoverfly's head is almost entirely covered in its eyes in many cases. Another easy feature to look out for is the length of the antennae. Bees and wasps have quite long finger-like antennae, and those are the typical sort of long feeler antennae, whereas hoverflies, in nearly all cases, have quite short, stubby antennae. There are one or two exceptions to that, but they all have antennae that are shorter than the bees and the wasps. There's some other things you can look out for in the wing venation and so on, which requires a bit of a closer look. But if you go to the Pollinator Monitoring Scheme website, you can download a guide to the insect groups that picks out some of these differences and helps you sort of work out which type of insect you're looking at.
And how many species are there in the UK of hoverfly?
Of hoverflies, there are just over 280 on the British list at the moment. So it's a reasonably large group, although if you look at flies in Britain as a whole, there's over 7,000 species of flies. So hoverflies are just one particular family within the whole set of flies. But a lot of them are relatively easy to recognise as being hoverflies. And as I say, there are about 280 species. So if you do want to get into the species identification, it is a bit of a challenge, but there's some really good books out there. And there's some really helpful and active groups on social media. On Facebook, for instance, there's a fantastic UK Hoverflies Facebook group that the Hoverfly Recording Scheme people are involved with. And they are very, very helpful in helping people check their identifications. If you can get a photo of what you've seen, of course, that helps. So there's quite a lot of places where you can get assistance with this, and it can be a really fascinating group. It's big enough to be interesting and to pose some identification challenges, but it's not so enormous that it's completely overwhelming. And I think most people find that they can start to recognise a few species pretty quickly.
I had some amazing ones a couple of years back. I'm really lucky to garden on the edge of an oak woodland, and I had the hornet hoverfly, and I had another one that was like a creamy black colour but very shiny, and I've got a feeling its name was something like Volucella, but I think I'm probably pronouncing that wrong and you can correct me. But I haven't seen any this year, and I don't know whether that's an effect of something that's going on in the area or whether it's just too early and even still a bit cold. You know, when might we see these?
There certainly are plenty of hoverflies out and flying at the moment, but the two that you just mentioned, Sarah, the two Volucella species, so the hornet hoverfly is another Volucella related to the other one that you mentioned. And they are both ones that you tend to see a little bit later in the year. So I haven't seen either of those yet this year, but I would expect as we get into July, they should start appearing. So they're relatively late summer species, but there are hoverfly species active pretty much throughout the year. Actually, even on a mild day in winter, there are a few species that overwinter as adults that you stand a chance of seeing. But then as we get into the spring and summer, the numbers build up. And in fact, June and July are the sort of real peak months in terms of the numbers of species that you could potentially see. So, yeah, I would have thought they would be out and about soon.
Right, I shall relax for now. What are some of the more common species that you might see, and I suppose some of the rarer ones, just that people might recognise?
There's a whole mix, of course, within those 280 species, but the one that's generally considered to be the most numerous and widespread is one that's called the marmalade hoverfly, Episurfus balteatus. And before we go any further, actually, just to pick up on the names of hoverflies, rather few hoverflies actually have English names that are widely used. English names have been invented for all of them. And Stephen Falk, who is a very expert entomologist, has an absolutely amazing collection of hoverfly photos on Flickr. And if you look for Stephen Falk, Falk, on Flickr, he does lots of other insect groups as well, but hoverflies is one of the groups that he's done very, very thoroughly. And he has a fantastic collection of photos, and he has come up with English names for every species. But at the moment, they're not very widely used, and I'm afraid I'm very bad at remembering the English names. But going back to the question you asked about the commonest species, the commonest species does have an English name, and it's called the marmalade hoverfly. And it is a typical black and yellow stripy hoverfly, but it's often seen in very large numbers, partly because it migrates from further south in Europe. And enormous numbers of these hoverflies have been shown to be flying in across the Channel and arriving in Britain in the early part of the year. And they then go on to have several generations where they actually breed in this country. And then at the end of the summer, they start migrating back towards southern Europe again. So the idea of hoverflies migrating is something that people often find surprising, but there's been some quite recent research done by Carl Watton and colleagues at Exeter University, showing that this species does migrate in enormous numbers and has a really big impact on the hoverflies that we see. And then you also asked about rare species, and again, within those 280 species, there are quite a lot of very rare species. And obviously, whether you're likely to see one of those depends on whether you happen to live in the right place and have the right habitats near to you. But often the rarest species are the ones that have particularly specialised habitat requirements. And one example that there's a really interesting project going on at the moment is for the pine hoverfly, which is Blera phallax, is its scientific name. And that's a species that's confined to just a few sites in the Cairngorms in Scotland. It's not one I've ever seen. I'd love to see it. It's quite a dramatic looking hoverfly. It's mostly black with a bright orange tip to its abdomen. And its larvae develop in rot holes in pine trees in the pine forests in that part of Scotland. And it has become really, really restricted, and it's a real sort of conservation concern that it could be really vulnerable due to that limitation. So there's a project going on at the moment that goes under the heading of rare invertebrates in the Cairngorms, where a range of organisations have been working to try and increase the amount of suitable habitat. And there's also been a big captive rearing project going on, actually getting these hoverflies to breed in captivity. And the Zoological Society of Scotland has been involved with helping to rear thousands of the larvae, which are now being reintroduced into their natural habitats. So hopefully this is going to have a real beneficial effect on the populations and make them much safer and more secure than just being confined to these one or two sites. So that's a really interesting one that's just going on at the moment.
And on the whole, are they quite specific in terms of their feeding habits or where they will actually lay eggs? I don't really know much about the life cycle of them, or is it some and some?
The basic life cycle, I suppose, is quite similar to butterflies and moths in that the hoverfly lay eggs, the eggs hatch into larvae, and then the larvae go into a pupal stage from which the next generation of adult hoverflies emerges. So that basic pattern is the same for all hoverflies, but there's quite a lot of variety in what the larvae actually do. So a lot of the typical black and yellow hoverflies that you see visiting flowers, their larvae are actually really useful things to have in the garden because they prey on aphids, on the greenfly and blackfly on plants. And hoverfly larvae are actually really effective predators of aphids. So from that point of view, they play a very large and important role in pest control, both in gardens and for some of the agricultural crops as well. And that marmalade hoverfly that we spoke about earlier on is one of the ones that, partly because it comes across in such large numbers, it does play a really significant role in aphid control. So there's a whole group of hoverflies that their larvae do that. There's another quite large group that have larvae that develop in what is known under the technical term of squidge, any sort of damp, muddy, decaying matter. Hoverfly people tend to refer to that as squidge or squidgy conditions. And the larvae develop in this wet, decaying matter, and they feed on the sort of bacteria and some of the decay processes that are associated with that. And some of the very common hoverflies, there's a group of hoverflies called drone flies in genus Eristalis, which are very commonly seen in gardens and elsewhere. And they have larvae that are known as rat-tailed maggots. And if people go pond dipping, they find some of these rat-tailed maggots. And they're called rat-tailed because they have a really long breathing tube at the hind end of their abdomen, which allows them to have the breathing tube at the top of the water and pick up the oxygen, whilst the front end of the larva can be down in these really decaying, squidgy conditions where there's not much oxygen. And it allows them to feed on those sort of bacterial outputs while still getting the oxygen that they need from the surface. So that's another major group. And then there are a few other types as well. There's a few larvae that do actually develop inside plants, often in the stems or the roots. And so quite a mixture of different lifestyles, if you like, but they all go through those sort of larval part of their life cycle. And it's often the larvae that have these particular requirements that determine where they can live.
Yeah, I remember finding some of those rat-tail maggots it was probably like an upturned water butt lid or something with some water had just collected in it years ago. So thinking about gardens and what we have and what we leave and the habitats we might try and create, if we were trying to help hoverflies out in our gardens, what would be really good things to do?
Yeah, so the best and probably most obvious thing that you can do is just have lots of flowers. And most flies have relatively short tongues compared to bees, so they tend to like the more open structured type of flowers. So daisy family type flowers and some of the umbellifer flowers can be really, really good for them. And by providing plenty of flowers and trying to get flowers all the way through the season from early spring through to the autumn, and that does a really good job to help the adult hoverflies feed. The adult hoverflies actually feed on nectar to get energy, but in a lot of hoverflies, they also feed on pollen. And in many cases, the female hoverflies actually have a requirement to feed on pollen to get protein to mature their eggs. So they are very much dependent on flowers. And in fact, in the United States, hoverflies are called flower flies rather than hoverflies to really sort of pick up on that flower connection. So providing flowers is a great thing to do. But other than that, I think the usual sort of wildlife gardening ideas of not being too tidy and trying to have a bit of variety in your garden, some of the sort of dead wood piles and even compost heaps where you get some of the decaying matter that we spoke about earlier on can be quite good breeding sites for some of the hoverflies that like these more squidgy conditions. And if you've got space for a pond, that will be good for some of the hoverflies and for lots of other wildlife as well. So I think probably those are all fairly unsurprising things that most wildlife gardeners would probably be doing anyway. But it really does help the hoverflies as well if you can get those sort of mix of conditions there.
Thinking about my kind of work, we've got an Artemisia plant in the garden which is smothered. For some reason, the black fly this year has just exploded everywhere and our plants are covered. I actually wanted to take this Artemisia out because it's a bit of a thug in the border. I had plans to take it out yesterday and I looked at it and it was smothered in black fly and smothered in lots of different larvae of various things. I suspect some were ladybirds, but I think some were hoverfly as well. So if you had a plant, although it seems a bit counterintuitive to leave this plant that's under attack by something like aphids, it's also, I guess, fairly important to stand back and let these larval stages do their work as well, if you can, if you've got the space and time to do that.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, obviously, from a gardener's perspective, I guess it's always a difficult balance as to how long you leave things in that circumstance. But I think, yeah, if you can actually see that there are larvae there sort of potentially attacking the aphids, then yeah, it's fantastic if you can let that process complete and hopefully it will reach some sort of balance that will allow the plants and the insects to survive. So yeah, I think that'd be really good.
It's never ideal to have aphids of any sort, but in a way, it is quite good to have them, because I'm quite excited now going out there taking pictures of all these larvae hoovering up these aphids.
Yeah.
So, although they seem a bit of a pain, they're actually quite a good food source. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking about how they might like to drink as well, they're so minuscule. Can they mop up water from pretty much wherever they go, or do you need to provide some sort of water source for them?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure I have a complete answer to that. So I think, as far as I understand it, most hoverflies get most of their moisture from the nectar in the flowers. But as we've discussed, for some of them, the larvae have a definite requirement for water. And even if you can't have a pond in your garden, you can still sort of have little containers of water, perhaps. And in fact, there is a project run from Sussex University where they're asking people to have hoverfly lagoons, which you can basically do in a sort of plastic container of some sort, and just allow some water and some leaves and some other bits and pieces of detritus just to sort of do their thing in a container. And that's when you get some of these rat-tailed maggot type hoverflies laying their eggs into there. I think it goes under the name of the Buzz Club at Sussex University. And if you look for hoverfly lagoons, you can probably find the details about how to get involved with that. So that's one particular thing that you can do. But particularly when we do go through these periods of hot and dry weather, so certainly where I am at the moment, it's been pretty dry for a while now. And I think hoverflies, along with some other insects, do get to the point where they really are seeking out moisture if they can't get enough from the nectar. So again, ponds will help with that. But in the absence of a pond, if you've got a bird bath or something, you might occasionally find that insects will visit that. But they do sometimes pick up moisture from the dew overnight and that sort of thing. And some of them will also feed on other substances, such as honeydew, the sticky substance that aphids produce. We get the honeydew on the leaves. Some hoverflies prefer to feed from that. I think it all comes back to trying to provide a good mix of conditions within a garden or other habitats, and they'll find their way around.
I remember actually, I've seen that about building the hoverfly lagoons. I must do that. I must go and create some squidge in the garden. My final question about them really is, in terms of the fact that they mimic other species, is that just a defence mechanism?
It seems to be, and the mimicry for some of them is absolutely amazing. Particularly, there are a few hoverflies that mimic bumblebees. So the hoverflies end up being hairy like bumblebees, and they have the same sorts of banded colour patterns that some of the bumblebees have. And some of those hoverflies, even within one species, you get different colour forms to match the different species of bumblebee. So the mimicry can be quite incredible, and it can certainly fool entomologists. And the assumption is that it also fools their predators, particularly visual predators and particularly birds, for instance. So there are many birds that feed on a wide range of insects, and the theory is that they soon learn to avoid the bees and the wasps that can sting them. And by learning the colour patterns that the bees and wasps have, they then avoid the hoverflies that look like them as well. And that has been shown to be the case. So there have been some very sort of clever experiments done with birds in captivity and with feeding them different types of insect to see how they react. And it has been shown that they are quite wary of hoverflies if they've already experienced a bee or a wasp. But it is very variable, and different birds have different reactions to this. Flycatchers, for instance, which are real specialist predators of insects, seem to be able to tell instantly that something is a hoverfly and not a bee or a wasp. So in that case, the hoverfly protection seems to break down a bit. So there's a lot of complexity here. And it's also true that there's a lot of hoverflies that look a bit like bees and wasps, but are not such good mimics as the really good ones. And that sort of leads to the question about whether they really are still getting any protection. As far as I can tell from the research that's been done on this, on the whole, they do get at least some protection from it. And even having a little bit of protection, even if it just makes a bird or another predator hesitate for a moment, that gives the fly that extra opportunity to just fly away. And they are such good acrobats, aerial aerobats, whatever you want to call them. They have such amazing flying capabilities that even with a sort of millisecond or two of delay, that gives them a chance to get up and flying. And once they're flying, they're probably going to get away from a lot of their predators. So there definitely does seem to be the benefit that they get from that. And so, as you say, that is the sort of obvious explanation, and it does seem to be the case. but with a lot of complexity around exactly which predators and exactly how much protection they do get at any given time.
They're amazing, aren't they? I mean, so you mentioned obviously Stephen Falk's Flickr and the online guide to hoverflies. Is there anything else that you could recommend to people if they are interested in finding out or learning more about hoverflies?
There's a really good field guide. So if you want to get an actual book on hoverflies, it's just called Britain's Hoverflies, a Field Guide. And it's by Stuart Ball and Roger Morris, who are the two people who run the Hoverfly Recording Scheme. And Stuart and Roger have been running that scheme for quite a long time now. And over the years, they also run lots of training courses, and they have done such an amazing amount of activity to get people interested in hoverflies and recording them. And their book is really, really good. It's a photographic guide, and it doesn't cover all the little tiny hoverflies that are very difficult to identify from photos, but it does cover all the bigger ones that you're likely to see and notice and take photographs of. And it's absolutely packed full of useful information. So I definitely recommend that. Yeah, and then the other things that we've mentioned about the online resources that are available. Once you sort of start to get into some of those, it's easy to get hooked on it, and you can end up getting really obsessed with looking at hoverflies. And they do make really good subjects for photography. And I think the advent of digital cameras and the fact that even cameras on phones these days can take such good photos of insects has really sort of revolutionised the way that people can get involved in this. The photos that you get these days, you can often see detail in the photos that you can't see very easily with the naked eye. And once you start getting interested in the photography side of things, it helps with the identification, but it also helps you realise what the insects are actually doing and how they're behaving and how they're interacting with the flowers and the other species around them. So I think, yeah, lots of potential to take up an interest and get involved with that.
Thank you, Martin, for sharing your knowledge of and passion for hoverflies. And thank you for listening. I hope your outdoor spaces are blessed with tons of hoverflies over the coming weeks. So I was going to say that Dr. Ian Bedford's Bug of the Week makes a great case for leaving sandy areas in your garden. But once you hear about the activities of the Beewolf, you may not be quite so convinced.
Until recently, the largest of our solitary wasps, the Beewolf, was considered rare in Britain. But this wasp, with its dark brown head, yellow face, thick black antennae and yellow and black hooped body, has become much more common throughout southern England, where it can be seen from early June to mid-September. As its name suggests, the Beewolf is a natural enemy of honeybees, although it doesn't kill and eat them, since adult beewolves only feed on nectar. The bees are actually captured alive by the female beewolves for a much more sinister and prolonged death. When caught, the honeybee is held tightly under the beewolf's body, where it's quickly stung and paralysed. She then carries it away to a sandy sloping bank in a sunny location where she'd earlier excavated a network of underground chambers. The victim is then dragged into one of the chambers, where it's rolled onto its back. The beewolf then flies off to catch more bees, eventually filling each chamber with a stack of 4 or 5 paralysed bodies, onto which she lays an egg. Eventually, the chambers of her underground prison are full, with around 100 paralysed bees all waiting to be eaten alive by the beewolf's grubs that soon begin to emerge from the eggs. Over the following 10 days, the grubs feast on the bees and rapidly grow, eventually spinning a cocoon, from which the new beewolves hatch the following year. A gruesome story, but as with so many other things in the bug world, there's something we've learned from the beewolf that may now help us. We've managed to solve the mystery of why the paralysed bees don't go mouldy within the humid underground chambers whilst they're waiting to be eaten. Scientists discovered that beewolf eggs produce nitric oxide, which then reacts with the air in the underground chambers to form nitrogen dioxide, which then effectively protects the paralysed bees from decay. The nitrogen dioxide levels, though, are very high, way above those permitted within our towns and cities, so it's of great interest that the beewolf eggs and grubs are not affected by this toxic environment. Understanding their natural survival mechanisms will have great benefits for human health in the future.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.